lost my daughter and my two grandchildren to something that I never imagined would happen.
I lost my daughter and my two grandchildren to something I never imagined would happen. That's Rosie's mother, speaking after the worst week of her life, her voice barely holding together. Because on March 4th, 2021, in a quiet house in North St. Louis County, a husband who had already hurt his wife more times than anyone had managed to stop, walked back into her home after she'd finally kicked him out, and by the time police forced the door open hours later, 3 people were dead. This is the story of Roseanne McCully and her 2 children, Kaden Johnson and Kaye Brooks.
People gathered today in Clayton to recognize the lives lost of a mother and her 2 children. They're calling for a stop to domestic violence and letting people know why it's important to speak up to prevent more tragic events like this from happening. News 11's Ty Hawkins spoke to the mother of Roseanne McCully, who was killed by her husband.
Bobby McCully murdered Roseanne McCully and 2 of her kids. On Saturday in Clayton, people met to honor her and her 2 children.
It's also the story of every single point along the way where the system that was supposed to protect them had a chance to, and didn't. If you want true crime told with care about the people at the center of it, subscribe and stay with this one. Let's start with who Rosie actually was, because before any of this, she was someone building a genuinely full life. Roseanne McCully, known to everyone who loved her as Rosie, was born and raised in Missouri, and creativity ran through everything she touched from a young age. A paintbrush, a sewing machine, a cake pan. It didn't matter what the medium was. She found a way to turn it into something that felt personal and specific to her. She attended the University of Missouri-St. Louis and graduated in 2018 with a bachelor's degree in communications, a field that suited her naturally because Rosie had a genuine gift for making people feel seen. She built her own businesses from that gift. She founded Glitter on the 8th, a custom design shop specializing in hand-decorated shoes, tumblers, and keepsakes. She also ran Creative Sweets, a home bakery known locally for vibrant, elaborate cakes. She'd even made her own wedding cake, which tells you everything about both her skill and her determination to do things her own way. She worked a day job too, as a billing supervisor at Centene Corporation, balancing that steady income against the businesses she was building on the side, all while raising 3 children largely on her own initiative and energy. She was a mother to Kaden, 13, quiet and respectful, but fiercely protective of his younger siblings, and Kaye, 6, a bubbly little girl who loved to dance and laugh at everything. Her youngest, a 1-year-old daughter, had just started exploring the world around her. Everything Rosie did, every sale, every late night decorating a cake, every post on social media promoting her work, had her kids as the reason behind it. Behind that busy, creative, outwardly successful life, though, Rosie was living with fear she worked hard to keep mostly hidden. She had married Bobby McCully III in July of 2018, after the 2 had already been together for years. Bobby worked as a truck driver for a local transportation company. In the early years, by every indication, things had seemed hopeful enough to build a life around. But the reality behind closed doors told a very different story than the one visible from outside. Court records document a long history of domestic abuse well before the marriage even happened. In 2017, Rosie filed a domestic violence complaint against Bobby. Like a lot of survivors navigating an abusive relationship, she ultimately chose not to press charges, and the case was dismissed. The cycle continued. After the wedding, by neighbors' accounts, things got worse rather than better. Bobby's temper flared easily and often. Neighbors described hearing shouting from the McCully home almost every other night. Crashes, yelling, crying, a grim and recurring soundtrack in an otherwise ordinary residential street. Rosie kept trying to make it work anyway, hoping, the way people in these situations so often hope, that things would eventually shift. Her social media became something close to a lifeline, a place where she could speak pieces of the truth, even if only in glimpses. She posted things that hinted at real pain, at terrifying nights and unhealed wounds, without always spelling out the full picture. Just days before her death, she posted that she'd been hospitalized. Her injuries were severe. Bobby had allegedly stomped on her chest and abdomen. CT scans showed no internal bleeding, but the muscle damage and bruising were extensive enough that she was sent home with morphine and other medication just to manage the pain. In that post, she was honest about her shame, about trying to hide the bruises, about blaming herself the way survivors of abuse so often do. And underneath all of it was still a flicker of hope that maybe, if she held on a little longer, something would finally change. Bobby's response to that post wasn't remorse, it was cruelty, an ominous message making clear he felt no shame at all, and hinting, in a way that unsettled everyone who saw it, that worse was still coming. Between January and February of 2021, Rosie called police multiple times. These weren't minor disputes, they were calls made out of genuine desperation, domestic violence, threats, fear for her safety. Records show multiple calls from the McCully home in those final weeks alone, at least one of them specifically categorized as domestic violence. Despite all of that documented history, Bobby remained free. After that hospitalization, prosecutors filed charges, but only third-degree misdemeanor assault, not anything that reflected the severity of stomping on someone's chest and abdomen hard enough to cause extensive muscle damage. Under the department's protocols at the time, a standard misdemeanor warrant like that one didn't trigger active task force tracking. That's a detail worth sitting with directly, because it means that even after Bobby had a documented warrant out for his arrest, no one was actively out looking for him. If he happened to get pulled over at a traffic stop, officers might have taken him into custody. Nobody was assigned to go find him before that happened. Rosie, for her part, didn't wait for the system to act. She kicked Bobby out of the house herself. She began the process of filing for divorce. She even posted publicly asking for help moving his remaining belongings out of the home, a small, practical act of reclaiming her own space. Her friends and followers rallied around her online, genuinely believing she was on her way to something safer, something better. But leaving an abusive relationship doesn't automatically end the danger. Sometimes it escalates it. And on the night of March 4th, 2021, that's exactly what happened. Around 8:30 p.m., a neighbor spotted Bobby sneaking into Rosie's home. Alarmed, they called police. Officers responded, knocked on the door, looked around the property, and, seeing no immediate signs of trouble, left. That decision would haunt the department and the community for a long time afterward. Bobby waited until the house was quiet. Then, according to the probable cause statement prosecutors later filed, he unlawfully entered Rosie's home with the specific purpose of killing her. He held her and the children against their will for what investigators believe was several hours, a stretch of time no one outside that house can fully account for. Whatever happened in those hours, pleading, arguing, long stretches of forced silence, ended the only way it was always going to end once he made that decision to come back. Around midnight, a neighbor was woken by unmistakable sounds coming from Rosie's house. Shouting, screaming, then a loud bang that carried through the quiet street. Moments later, the lights inside flickered in a way that read, in hindsight, as unmistakably wrong. Unsettled by the eerie silence that followed, the neighbor tried calling Rosie twice. Both times, no answer. That's when concern turned into certainty that something had gone terribly wrong, and they called 911 again.
A friend believes that she was the last person to speak to Rosie alive. She last talked to Rosie around 6:30, but planned to check in regularly.
And I'm calling. She didn't answer, and I sent her a text message.
Around 10:30, St. John texted, "Answer me." The response was, "Busy, I will hit you back shortly." St. John wrote, "Girl, I was about to beat these streets," but then she realized that wasn't a normal response from Rosie. She wrote, "Bobby, let my niece go." There was no response. At the time, he may have still been in the house after killing Rosie.
This time, officers didn't wait outside. They entered from the back of the house, weapons drawn, announcing themselves. Getting no response, they forced the door open. What they found just beyond the entrance were the bodies of Roseanne McCully, her son Kaden Johnson, and her daughter Kaye Brooks. Each of them had been shot. The scene showed clear signs of a struggle, furniture overturned, items scattered across the room. Bobby and the couple's 1-year-old daughter were both missing. Let's go back, for a moment, to that first police response earlier in the evening, because it's the detail that draws the most scrutiny in hindsight, and it deserves a fair, honest look rather than either simple condemnation or simple excuse. When officers responded to the 8:30 p.m. call about Bobby sneaking into the house, they did what a welfare check response typically involves: knocking on the door, looking around the immediate area, checking for obvious signs of forced entry or distress. Finding none of that visible from outside, they left. Standard protocol for a call like that one, on its own, without additional context, often looks exactly like this. The problem is that this call didn't exist without context. It existed inside a documented history stretching back years. A 2017 complaint, multiple 2021 calls specifically flagged as domestic violence, a recent hospitalization severe enough to require morphine, and an active but low-priority misdemeanor warrant that wasn't being actively pursued. None of that history was necessarily visible to the specific officers responding to one call about someone entering a house on a particular night. Whether it should have been, whether a more integrated system would have flagged Bobby McCully's name the instant that address came up as a known high-risk domestic violence location, is exactly the kind of systemic question advocates have pushed loudest in the years since. That's the distinction worth holding on to here. The individual officers who checked the house that night made a defensible decision based on what was immediately visible to them. The system around them, the misdemeanor classification that meant nobody was actively searching for a man with a documented decade of violent behavior, the lack of any cross-referencing that would have flagged this specific address as urgent, is what actually failed. Blaming a single decision made by 2 officers standing outside a quiet house misses the much larger, much harder problem underneath it. What followed was a citywide manhunt, not just to find a suspect, but to find a child who might still be in danger, with no way for anyone to know for certain what state she'd be found in, or when. Police quickly identified Bobby McCully III, the estranged husband, as the suspect, and issued an Amber Alert for the missing 1-year-old. The alert went out across social media, television, highway billboards, every channel available, as fast as it could move. Authorities released details of the vehicle, a silver Dodge Charger, along with photos of Bobby, making clear they believed he was armed and that the child's life could genuinely be at risk. A few hours later, at around 3:30 in the morning, the child was safely dropped off at a relative's home in North St. Louis. A family member contacted police immediately, and officers rushed to retrieve her. She was checked at a local hospital and, to everyone's enormous relief, found to be physically unharmed. That relief was real. It was also brief, because the search for Bobby himself was far from over. Officers worked through the rest of the night and into the morning, tracking every possible lead, speaking with family members, tracing phone records, pulling surveillance footage from across the area. They contacted Bobby's mother, Michelle Clayton, hoping she could help locate him. According to authorities, she wasn't cooperative. She claimed not to know where he was, a claim investigators quickly began to doubt. The break in the case came through surveillance cameras, which caught Bobby's vehicle near an intersection close to the city-county line. From there, investigators traced the car to a specific block in the old North St. Louis neighborhood, the same street, it would turn out, where Michelle Clayton lived. Inside that vehicle, officers found Bobby McCully. As they moved to arrest him, he shot himself. He was pronounced dead at the scene. There would be no trial, no confession under questioning, no accounting, in his own words, for what he'd done or why. The person responsible for an act of violence this total chose, in the end, to escape the process of being held accountable for it, leaving even more unanswered pain behind for everyone who survived him. The location of his death raised immediate questions. His car had been found parked near his own mother's residence, which fueled real suspicion that she'd been actively shielding him during the hours he was being hunted. Authorities acted on that suspicion. Michelle Clayton, 55, was arrested and charged with felony hindering prosecution, accused of lying to investigators about her son's whereabouts during the exact window when he was still at large with the couple's 1-year-old daughter in his possession. Her bond was set at $25,000, cash only. As of the most recent public reporting on this case, the final resolution of her charge hasn't been widely publicized, meaning it's worth being careful not to state definitively what, if anything, she was ultimately convicted of. That arrest deepened an already devastating tragedy for the community watching it unfold. Many people simply couldn't process how a mother, herself a grandmother to 2 of the children who'd just been murdered, could have chosen, in that moment, to protect her son rather than help find him. It added another layer to an already brutal public conversation about the cycles of silence and denial that so often surround domestic violence, even inside the families of the people committing it. Let's slow down on Bobby McCully's history for a moment, because once investigators started pulling his record, the picture that emerged was deeply disturbing, and it directly raises the question of how a documented pattern this long could exist without ever meaningfully stopping him. Court documents revealed multiple domestic violence cases stretching back to 2008. As far back as that year, women had filed restraining orders against him. One woman said he'd pointed a gun at her and her child. Another said he'd used a new girlfriend to intimidate her and her own mother. In 2010, he was convicted of false imprisonment, holding someone against their will, the same core act he would eventually be accused of doing to Rosie and her children more than a decade later. For that 2010 conviction, he received a year of probation and an ankle monitor. No jail time. That's the piece of this story worth sitting with longest. A man with a documented pattern going back over a decade, restraining orders, a gun pointed at a woman and her child, a false imprisonment conviction, moved through the system repeatedly without ever facing consequences proportional to what he'd actually done. Each individual incident, taken alone, apparently looked survivable to the system processing it. Strung together, in hindsight, it reads as an unmistakable trajectory. It's worth pausing specifically on that false imprisonment conviction from 2010, because it's not just one more entry on a list. It's a direct preview of exactly what would happen to Rosie and her children 11 years later. Holding someone against their will, refusing to let them leave, using presence and control, rather than only physical violence to dominate a situation. That's precisely the pattern investigators say played out over the several hours he held Rosie and the children hostage inside their own home before the shooting. A conviction for that same behavior existed on his record for over a decade, and the consequence attached to it was a year of probation and an ankle monitor. There's no way to know, with certainty, whether meaningfully different consequences at that earlier point would have changed anything that happened in 2021. But it's a documented data point that fits the pattern experts in domestic violence describe constantly, that coercive control and forced confinement are not lesser, adjacent behaviors to lethal violence. They're frequently the direct rehearsal for it. There's also the question of what a truck driving job and a probationary period with an ankle monitor actually meant in practice for someone with Bobby's documented history. An ankle monitor tracks location. It doesn't, on its own, prevent someone from continuing a pattern of intimidation and control over people who aren't legally protected from him through a restraining order specific to them. Rosie wasn't in his life yet during that 2010 case. By the time she was, whatever supervision existed from that earlier conviction had already run its course, leaving no formal mechanism connecting his documented history of violence to the new relationship he was building. This is, in a very real sense, one of the structural gaps domestic violence advocates point to constantly. The legal system tends to process each relationship, each complaint, each incident, largely in isolation, case by case, victim by victim, rather than building a comprehensive picture of a pattern that follows one person across multiple relationships and years. A restraining order filed by one woman in 2008 doesn't automatically follow that person into a risk assessment for the next relationship they enter. Rosie, filing her own complaint in 2017, was in some sense starting from zero in the eyes of the system, even though the man she was reporting had already demonstrated, repeatedly, exactly what he was capable of with other women before her. In the days after the murders, the community came together the way communities do after something like this. Vigils, purple balloons symbolizing the fight against domestic violence, candles and flowers and handmade signs left outside Rosie's home. People who'd never met her, and people who'd known her for years, both came forward to talk about how her art, her warmth, and her resilience had touched them. Rosie's close friend Stephanie was among the last people to speak with her. She described how Rosie had finally started opening up about the abuse in real terms, especially after that final hospitalization, and how she'd urged Rosie directly to leave, to find shelter, to seek real protection. Rosie hesitated, not because she didn't want to be safe, but because she was afraid for her children specifically. That fear turned out to be justified in the worst possible way. Stephanie described texting Rosie around 6:30 that evening, planning to check in regularly through the night. Around 10:30, she texted again, "Answer me," and got back a short response, "Busy, I will hit you back shortly." Stephanie replied lightly, not sensing anything wrong yet. Then something shifted, and she sent a different message. "Bobby, let my niece go," directly addressing him, sensing somehow that he was the one actually holding the phone. There was no response after that. At the time that message was sent, he may still have been inside the house, in the hours after already killing Rosie and both of her older children. The community's grief turned quickly into organized anger, and that anger turned into action. Just days after the murders, activists organized a rally outside the St. Louis County Justice Center in Clayton, not only to honor Rosie, Kaden, and Kaylee, but to demand real change in how domestic violence cases get handled. People held signs, chanted, and shared their own stories of survival and loss. They called for stronger protections for victims and for the justice system to treat abuse reports with the seriousness those reports actually deserve. U.S. Representative Cori Bush spoke at that rally, and she spoke as a survivor herself. She described nearly losing her own life multiple times during an abusive relationship, and the specific moment she finally got out, calling her father from work, unable to say a word, and hearing him simply say he'd come get her. She'd packed trash bags with her things and waited by the door. That call, she said, saved her life. She used that story to push directly for more focus and more resources in exactly the areas where, as she put it, there clearly hadn't been enough. Because tragedies like this one keep happening precisely where that focus has been missing. Rosie's own mother spoke too, and her grief carried a specific, pointed frustration at how the system had handled her daughter's case. She pointed directly at the decision to charge that final assault as a misdemeanor rather than something more serious. A decision that meant, in practice, police weren't actively searching for Bobby, only prepared to arrest him if they happened to encounter him some other way. Had he crossed paths with an officer during a routine stop, he might have been taken into custody. Nobody was assigned to go looking for him before it was too late. This wasn't framed by anyone involved as an isolated failure of one department or one officer. It became, for the people organizing around Rosie's death, a symbol of something much larger. How systems built to protect people from domestic violence can fail through a long accumulation of small, individually defensible decisions, none of which look catastrophic in isolation, but which add up to exactly the kind of gap a determined abuser can walk straight through. Let's talk about what's changed or been proposed in the aftermath, because a case this public, involving this many documented warning signs, put real pressure on Missouri's approach to domestic violence response. In the wake of the murders, there were public calls for legislative change specifically targeting the gaps this case exposed. Faster response times for domestic violence calls, upgrading stalking and strangulation charges from misdemeanors to automatic felonies, rather than leaving that classification to case-by-case prosecutorial discretion, and mandatory risk assessments in divorce proceedings where prior assault allegations are already on record. Those proposals emerged directly from advocates and lawmakers who pointed to this specific case as proof of exactly where the existing framework had broken down. Community organizations, including groups focused specifically on ending domestic violence, used the rally and the ongoing public attention to push the message that victims don't have to suffer in silence and that resources exist, even when, as in Rosie's case, the system's response to her repeated calls for help fell short of what the danger actually required. Prior to the murders, local social service agencies had also received reports concerning ongoing disturbances and volatile conditions inside the McCully household. No formal protective custody orders were ever established for the children as a result. That's a detail that sits alongside everything else. One more point in a long chain where intervention was theoretically possible and didn't happen at the level the situation demanded. St. Louis County Prosecutor Wesley Bell, addressing the case publicly, made a point of framing domestic violence as something bigger than an issue affecting only the women experiencing it directly. He said plainly that it takes a village to protect a child, and that domestic violence is too often treated as solely a women's issue, when in reality, it's a problem for everyone, because when it goes unaddressed, everyone in that family, including children with no ability to protect themselves, ends up exposed to its worst possible outcome. That's really the heart of what makes this case so hard to sit with. Every individual piece of it, the 2017 complaint that got dismissed, the 2010 false imprisonment conviction that resulted in probation and an ankle monitor instead of prison time, the misdemeanor charge after a hospitalization severe enough to require morphine, the officers who checked the house on the night of the murders and left without incident, the mother who allegedly lied to protect her son during the manhunt. None of those, examined completely alone, necessarily reads as the single decisive failure. But strung together across more than a decade, they describe a pattern where a documented, repeatedly violent man kept finding just enough space to continue, right up until the night there was no more space left for anyone but him. Rosie tried to protect her children the only ways available to her. She called the police, she filed a complaint, she eventually kicked her husband out and started the legal process of ending the marriage entirely. Each of those was a genuinely difficult, courageous step for someone living inside an abusive relationship to take. None of them, in the end, were enough to outpace what Bobby McCully had already decided to do. Today, people in St. Louis still talk about Rosie, her creativity, her warmth, the sheer scope of what she managed to build, while also raising 3 children, largely on her own effort. They talk about Kaden's quiet protectiveness over his younger siblings, and about Kaylee's laugh, and about a 1-year-old girl who will grow up mostly through photographs and family stories, rather than any memory of her own, of the mother and siblings she lost that night. The questions this case leaves behind aren't really mysteries in the traditional true crime sense. We know who did this. We know, in broad strokes, why. What's genuinely unresolved is the harder question: whether the specific individual decisions that let a documented, decade-long pattern of violence keep going could have been made differently, at almost any of a dozen different points, in a way that might have kept Rosie, Kaden, and Kaylee alive. We don't get to answer that question with any certainty now. What we can do is take seriously what the people who loved them have been saying since the day this happened: that the actual lesson here isn't about one uniquely evil man. It's about how many ordinary, individually explainable gaps a pattern like his can slip through, and what it would actually take systemically to close them before the next family runs out of time. If any part of this story affected you, and you or someone you know is dealing with domestic violence, please reach out to a local support service or the National Domestic Violence Hotline. You deserve to be taken seriously the first time you ask for help. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next one. I'll see you in the next one. I'll see you in the next one. I'll see you in the next